Welcome, everyone, to the second session of the Rural Communities Prepared for Disasters webinar series. This session will be offered in English with Spanish, Vietnamese, Russian, Mandarin Chinese, and Ukrainian translation with American Sign Language interpretation and CART real-time captioning in English. To choose your preferred language interpretation, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. When you select the ASL language channel, a separate window will pop out with the interpreter. To access CART real-time captioning, please click Show Captions at the bottom of your screen. Translated versions of the presentation slides will be provided in the chat throughout the webinar. Thank you for being here today. My name is Carissa Clark. I work in Strategic Communications at the Oregon Department of Emergency Management, and I'll be your host for the day. This is a two-part series focused on the unique challenges rural communities experience in preparing for emergencies, such as limited emergency resources, increased vulnerability to power outages, and remote locations that are more susceptible to islanding. During the next 90 minutes, our partners will share their knowledge of preparedness and lessons learned through lived experiences. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that conversations about disasters and emergencies can bring up strong emotions or memories. Today's discussion will include real experiences with emergencies and disasters. Some content may be emotionally difficult or triggering. You're invited to participate in whatever way feels safe for you. Please take breaks, step away, or seek support at any time. First up, let's go over some housekeeping items. To avoid disruptions and background noises, we've muted the microphones and disabled the videos of participants. We have many attendees today, therefore we can't have an open chat function. At the end of the event, we'll have a facilitated question and answer session during which the presenters will answer your questions. You can put the questions in the Q&A box throughout the event. There will be an evaluation sent out via email after the session. Your input is appreciated and will help us improve future sessions. While we're not expecting any problems during the presentation, should the presenter experience severe connectivity issues, we will do our best to re-engage or switch to the next agenda item. First up, I'd like to introduce Oregon Emergency Management Director Erin McMahon, who welcome you this morning. In her previous role as Principal Deputy General Counsel for the National Guard Bureau, Director McMahon guided the Bureau Chief through domestic disasters, including hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, and the COVID pandemic. She now oversees the Oregon Department of Emergency Management, which is responsible for helping Oregonians prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. Take it away, Director.
Thanks a lot, Carissa. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Rural Communities Prepare for Disaster webinar. As Carissa said, I'm Erin McMahon. I'm the Director of the Department of Emergency Management, and I am grateful to see so many partners, community leaders, emergency managers, nonprofit organizations, and residents come together for this important conversation. I'm going to try to not talk too fast to support our access and functional needs. Rural communities are certainly the backbone of Oregon and communities across our nation. They are resilient, resourceful, and deeply connected. But we also know that in our rural areas, we face unique challenges when disaster strikes, whether it's due to distance from resources, communication barriers, limited infrastructure, or the increasing frequency and severity, in our case, of wildfires and flooding. Preparedness in rural communities looks different in every community. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. What works in one county or in a tribal community may not work in another. But that's why collaboration and local knowledge and strong partnerships are really critical. At OEM, we believe preparedness starts with relationships that develop before those disasters happen. It starts with neighbors helping neighbors, trusted local voices, volunteer networks, our faith-based organizations, and community and healthcare providers. Today's webinar is going to serve as an opportunity for you to go ahead and share those lessons learned the tools and strategies that help communities prepare before emergencies can occur. Because preparedness saves lives, protects property, and helps communities recover faster. We also want to recognize that preparedness must include the whole community. That means ensuring that we are reaching people with disabilities, access and functional needs, our older adult population, agricultural communities, tribal nations, non-English speakers, and those who may already face barriers during emergencies. I want to thank all of today's presenters for being here, the organizers, and the participants for taking the time here to contribute to this discussion. Your work matters, and your commitment to preparedness helps build a safer, more resilient future for everyone. So thank you. Today, I'm looking forward to this great conversation, and I'll turn it back over to Carissa to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Director. We will begin today's session with a presentation on how recovery is funded by OEM's Disaster Recovery Program Manager, Quinn Butler. Quinn is a certified emergency manager with more than 8 years of experience in the emergency management field. Before joining OEM, Quinn worked in disaster recovery for the Washington Emergency Management Division for several years, where he led the development of the state's first recovery planning framework and supported numerous pre- and post-disaster community recovery planning efforts. Take it away, Quinn.
Good morning. Thank you, Carissa, and thank you all for being here today. And congratulations on making it here today. This is a step towards your preparedness. By being here, it shows that you want to be prepared for a disaster, which can happen at any day or time. And this is a step in your preparedness. Even learning about disaster recovery, which is a lot of what we'll be talking about today, that is a step again in your preparedness and understanding what resources are out there and available for you as an individual if you're impacted by a disaster, or perhaps you represent an organization or you belong to an organization, a church group that may be involved and find itself in the middle of a disaster in supporting your community with navigating the recovery process. So thank you for being here today. This morning, I'll be talking about, first I'll start off with just an emergency management overview, what that is, what it encompasses. That'll lead us into the disaster declaration process. We'll talk a little bit about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the Small Business Administration today. And I'll also just define disaster recovery. It encompasses quite a lot, as you'll come to find out. I'll also be spending some time talking about the sequence of delivery. How does an individual access resources, and what is that flow of resources, and where do they go to first when they're impacted by a disaster? And I'll wrap up today's discussion, my portion of the presentation, just talking about some of those key disaster recovery programs, whether it's at the federal level, at the state level, or the local nonprofit level. And I apologize, I should have started out. So for those who need a visual description of me, I am a young adult male with short brown hair. I have black glasses and a black polo on today. Okay, so when we want to talk about emergency management, this is probably one of the busier slides, so I do apologize for that. But what is emergency management? It encompasses, starting on the left-hand side of this slide, the pre-event. Before the disaster takes place, that's where we are today, right? We're in that preparedness phase. The most important phase of all, arguably, is being prepared for any disaster that might come our way, any event, whether it's a home fire or an earthquake or a flood, anything in between. We want to be prepared for all different types of things that come our way. Part of that preparedness and related to that is what's known as mitigation, and that's related to impact reduction. We're trying to reduce the impacts of that disaster that it might have. So for flooding, think about maybe it's installing some levees and some flood barriers, or planting some trees to help soak up that extra water. It could be putting on some, could be doing some reduction of trees and debris around your house to try to prevent the spread of wildfires. So that's mitigation. And then on the right-hand side of the slide is your after the disaster. Immediately after, there's the response, which really is what focuses on life safety and property preservation, and then recovery. That is where a lot of the heavy lifting and work is involved, where we'll be focusing our discussion today. But it's focusing on rebuilding, whether it's housing or infrastructure, and it's coordinating with a wide group of individuals and organizations from the tribal, federal, state, local governments, and nonprofit organizations, private sector, and so many volunteers that help a community recover. And then in between, you have what are called emergency communications. So that's the backbone of our 911 call centers. When you call 911, there's actually a component that our office is in charge of, which is to make sure that when you call 911, that physical infrastructure is in place, that you can make that call, and that there are backups available just in case you're not able to place that call, that we have backup infrastructure for you to do that, and as well as the alert and warning system. So making sure that you're signed up for emergency alerts and you receive that alert, that is something that our agency ensures that you're able to do. Next slide, please. You may have heard before that disasters start and end at the local level. So what does that really mean? It means that when you have that disaster, it will start out maybe with a local call to 911. You might have fire, your emergency services, police show up. You might have Red Cross or a faith-based group provide support to, maybe it's a home fire. But if that incident is growing, then that local jurisdiction, that city, they may request additional assistance from the county. Maybe you have your county sheriff's department involved. Maybe you have a county assessor's office or public works involved. And they might enact what's called mutual aid, where they're reaching out to neighboring jurisdictions, neighboring counties and communities, asking for additional assistance. And it's not just at that government level too. You might have a local Red Cross or Salvation Army or United Way office, but as that incident grows, they might be reaching out to their regional or even national contacts. And at the state level, it's the same thing. So as that incident grows, we'll be reaching out to our state partners and seeing if they can bring additional state resources. If it's going to be continuing to grow, then we might reach out to neighboring states and ask to bring their firefighting resources, for example, and then on up to the federal level for a major disaster. But no matter what, that disaster always will start at that local level, and recovery will also immediately begin with that response. We want to make sure that recovery is locally led and that we support it at the state. And then we work with our federal partners to also access all resources that we're able to bring. And again, it's not just government, it's also your VOAD partners. So those are your voluntary organizations active in disaster, like the United Way, like the Salvation Army, like the Red Cross, and many others that I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. So I mentioned I wanted to provide a definition of disaster recovery. Recovery involves addressing key functional areas necessary to assist communities affected by an incident to resume normal, or what you might have heard before as the new normal activities. Oftentimes after disaster, you'll hear people wanting to build back better, and that's an aspect of resiliency, which is directly tied to disaster recovery. You can become a resilient community before that disaster occurs, and then after that disaster occurs, gives you an additional opportunity to become a resilient community. Incorporate those home hardening steps, for example, to reduce fire hazards, and incorporating that mitigation helps you become a more resilient community. Knowing your neighbors, signing up for emergency alerts, that helps you become more ready and resilient for that next disaster. But when we talk about disaster recovery, it's usually lumped into several key areas, which we have here on the screen. So that's community assistance, those wraparound services. It could include, like I said, mitigation and accessing of state and federal resources, as well as supporting long-term recovery groups. I'll talk about that later today. And then economic recovery, how do we bring businesses back to the community? How do we reopen those businesses? Health services, how do we keep those hospitals open, and those clinics and dialysis clinics and mental health services? How do we continue to restore and provide those services? Excuse me, just a minute, I got it. Even with the rains that we've been getting, I still get some allergies. We also have human services. Again, that's tied to mental health as well, but how do we get people, make sure that they are receiving food assistance, that they retain their disability benefits, their Social Security benefits, their access to vital documents, their birth certificates and marriage certificates? How do we make sure they restore and replace those if needed? Housing recovery is pretty self-explanatory, but how do we get people into a safe, sanitary, secure, and stable living situation, whether that's back to their original location and make those repairs, or if their home needs to be rebuilt, or they're not able to live in there while repairs are made, are there temporary locations that we can have them be in while still trying to keep the community together? Because we don't want people to move away. We want people to return as quickly as possible. We want to reopen those schools. And so that's, of course, tied to also infrastructure and natural and cultural resources. How do we restore not only the built environment, but then also our natural and cultural resources that are a vital portion of how we define community. So disaster recovery is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's an extremely long process, much longer than most people realize. And it often takes several years before an individual and a community can recover. And the other speakers today will mention that as well, about when we talk about recovery, it really is a multi-year process for a community to recover. Next slide, please. So now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the sequence of delivery. And so as an individual, if you have a disaster that impacts you, then the first thing you want to do is assess. And I want you also to think, if maybe you're the head of an organization, or even an employee of an organization, or maybe a member of a church, just think about how you would do this not only for yourself, but your family and your community. So first, you want to assess, make sure you and your loved ones are safe, or your employees and your neighbors. You want to take deep breaths, take your time, and don't be afraid to ask for help. The next step is to document damage. Before you make any repairs, before you start moving things around, take pictures with your phone, identify and make a list of all damaged or lost items. And this is why it's important in the preparedness phase to document what is in your home, your living area, before that disaster occurs. You can make a little video of it, or there are some apps out there that you can write down some of those key personal property items in your home before the disaster occurs. But nevertheless, you want to take pictures of damaged items, estimate how much you think it might cost to repair or replace. And then if you have insurance, you want to contact your insurance company. So whether it's renter's insurance or business insurance or homeowners or flood insurance, you want to contact your insurance company to learn how to file a claim. And if you have any issues when working with your insurance provider, I strongly encourage you to reach out to the Department of Financial Regulation. They're a state agency. and we'll have that contact information shared with you in the chat. But you can reach out to them and they can take a second look and look at your policy and whether that insurance provider is giving you the full benefit that you've been paying into or not. And they can help explain your insurance to you. And so I highly recommend reaching out to the Department of Financial Regulation, or DFR. The next step is to report damages to local emergency management. Now, who is your local emergency manager? For rural communities, oftentimes it would be tied in with your sheriff's department. It's usually a 1 or 2 person shop, but you want to make sure you reach out to them. Sometimes they'll post something on their Facebook or their maybe the city or county webpage. They'll post something to say, hey, report damages to this location, or click on this link and you can find resources within your community, whether it's a disaster recovery center, or sometimes they're referred to as a multi-agency resource center. But these are locations for you to go to and report your damages and look for assistance that might be available to you. So sometimes you'll have Red Cross is one of the more prominent partners that might come and provide a small monetary amount to you just to help support you and your family staying in a hotel for a few nights, or a little bit of funding to replace necessary personal property, food or diapers or formula, things of that nature. But you want to make sure you report those damages, because that could lead to additional assistance if we can meet various indicators or thresholds as a local community and as a state. Then we can request federal assistance. So the more we know about your damages and your neighbor's damages, the better chance we have of making a strong case for why we need additional support and assistance. The next step is to stay informed. So that's another key reason to report those damages. There might be information about community recovery centers or town hall meetings. Oftentimes right after a disaster, they might take place in a local school gymnasium or a city hall, but you want to be able to stay informed about that. And so make sure you're following them on social media, or you're stopping by city hall or your sheriff's department to try to get more information about debris cleanup or donations and volunteers. And again, take deep breaths, take your time, and ask for help. Next slide, please. This is a little pie chart that also shows the disaster assistance sequence of delivery. So the last slide was more about what to do immediately after disaster. And then here's a slide that gives a little bit deeper into what you can expect. So as I said, recovery will start and end at that local level. And what that means is you have these voluntary agencies that are there from the very, very beginning. And then they're the first to arrive and very often the last to leave, long after state. And if FEMA is there, your federal emergency management agency partners, if they're in there, long after they've left, long after the state's left, you still have those VOAD partners, those voluntary organizations active in disaster, VOAD. And you can learn more about the VOAD partners by going to orvoad.org. So that's OregonVOAD.org. The first thing you can expect is these VOAD partners will provide emergency food, shelter, clothing, help with medical needs, cleanup, and maybe immediate debris removal, like removing perhaps trees that have fallen across your driveway or property, helping to clear the debris so that you can have access to your property. And then the next step is insurance. So again, making sure that you report the damages. So insurance, that personal insurance, is going to be the best opportunity for you as a disaster impacted individual to recover damages after disaster. So make sure that you keep your homeowners or renters insurance policies up to date. And I believe we have the speaker right after me will talk a little bit more about personal insurance, but making sure that you are keeping your policies up to date is really critical. If a disaster is large enough, we would have FEMA individual assistance. They're not a substitute for insurance. They do not cover all losses. It's just supplemental assistance. And it would be eligible, individuals and households would be eligible if they have uninsured or underinsured necessary expenses and disaster caused serious needs. So again, they're not going to, you may have heard about the FEMA trailers or things like that. And it's really more common to have a much smaller payout from FEMA than people realize. Next, we would have SBA. And SBA is the Small Business Administration. And people might think that they are just for businesses, and that's not actually the case. They're the largest source of financial assistance to disaster survivors. And what they do is they provide low interest loans to repair and replace homes, personal property, or businesses with damages that are not covered by insurance. And I have a few slides on them in just a minute. Then we would look to see if there's any state and other federal agency assistance programs or other financial assistance programs available. And I'll talk about that at the end of my slides. And then finally, back to those serious disaster-caused unmet needs, where you have, again, your voluntary agencies come in. And this is where you have a long-term recovery group, which is a group of government, non-government, faith-based, private sector, philanthropic partners, all coming together to try to support you as an individual and your household through a disaster case management process. They're looking at what do you specifically need to recover, and they're developing an individual recovery plan for you. And they're looking at every single resource to see if you've applied for it, if you've received assistance. And then if you still have those remaining unmet needs, they have what's called a disaster case manager would present that to the unmet needs roundtable. They're a subgroup of your long-term recovery group. But the unmet needs roundtable might consist of your VOAD partners and maybe a local credit union or a business that has said, yeah, we will provide X dollars for this disaster if you present the need. And then we'll review that need and see whether we can use a portion of our donated funds that we've collected to support that need. So we'll have another speaker talk about that in just a minute. Next slide, please. So just to give a little bit more detail on FEMA, since I usually get a lot of questions about FEMA's IA program, that's their Individual Assistance Program. Their Individual Assistance Program is part of their Individuals and Households Program, or IHP. And you do have to be a US citizen, non-citizen national, or qualified alien. That is the language of the federal government. FEMA must be able to verify the applicant's identity, and then the insurance or other forms of that disaster assistance received cannot meet their disaster cause needs. So it would be first you apply for insurance and other assistance available, and then if you still have a remaining need, then FEMA will look at your case and see how much they can provide to you. The IA program includes two main components: housing assistance and other needs assistance. Next slide, please. Now, the maximum amount of assistance you can receive from FEMA is through two separate grants. One of them is for housing assistance. That's for things like rental assistance or repair, maybe to help rebuild your home. And it's around $43,600. It changes every year. That's the maximum grant awarded. Typically, it's much, much lower on the order of about $5,000 to $10,000, but it really varies by individual and by disaster and by location. The other max grant is the Other Needs Assistance Program. That's for things like serious needs. It could be food and diapers and formula, sheltering, funeral assistance, childcare assistance, moving and storage. They have quite a different, quite a large number of different categories that fit under the Other Needs Assistance program. And again, it's usually around $5,000 to $10,000 that's awarded if you receive that assistance. Next slide, please. I wanted to note that FEMA individual assistance is incredibly rare for us to receive in Oregon. We just don't have those large-scale major disasters, thankfully, like we see in the Gulf states of the the Gulf states of the United States, so Louisiana and Florida and Georgia. However, we did receive FEMA individual assistance for some serious flooding in northeastern Oregon in 2020, as well as for the Labor Day fires of 2020. So we received 2 FEMA individual assistance declarations for those major disasters. The reason why it's so difficult to get is that FEMA looks at 6 factors for requesting for a state that is requesting FEMA individual assistance. And the 2 key ones that they really will focus in on are, does the state have the fiscal capacity and resources to respond to its own disaster? Is it able to come up through legislative means and other means to help their community recover? And how many homes are your primary homes, and how many of them are uninsured? And so those two pieces are really the primary things that they look at, is uninsured home and personal property losses. And so oftentimes it's a major disaster for that local community and for the state as a whole. But again, when FEMA is looking at the United States as a whole, they're really trying to focus their resources on those major and catastrophic disasters. And then there's other factors that they look at as well, such as the disaster impacted population profile, the demographics of the community, and the concentration of damages, the impact to community infrastructure, how many casualties are related to that disaster, and if there's any disaster-related unemployment. Next slide, please. Much more common in Oregon are these Small Business Administration disaster declarations. The reason being is that we only need to have 25 damaged homes or businesses with major damages, and that's roughly 40% or more in uninsured losses for the governor to request SBA assistance. And so that's a much easier, clearer threshold. They give us, the Small Business Administration gives us a specific number that we need to meet as a state in order to request assistance. And so SBA is much more common for us to receive their low interest disaster loan program. There's a couple other ways of getting Small Business Administration, but I won't go into those in the interest of time today. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the SBA is the largest financial provider of disaster assistance to individuals. They are disaster loans. They're low interest loans, typically around 2.8%. They have terms up to 30 years. There's no cost to apply. You can use as much or as little of what the SBA offers when you take out that loan. So there's no obligation. You don't have to take the full loan if you don't need it. And the individual can even use an SBA loan to refinance or to relocate if they so choose. So the SBA loans are incredibly flexible. It's not just for businesses and to help recoup lost capital, but it can also be used to repair or replace your primary residence or repair, replace personal property. And there's even loans for mitigation to help prevent future losses. Next slide, please. There are several other disaster recovery programs. United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA, is one of the larger ones, especially because the SBA does not provide assistance directly to farmers and ranchers that have been impacted by a disaster. They leave that to the USDA. And so if you're a farmer or rancher and you're impacted by a disaster, we really encourage you to reach out to your local Farm Services Agency office, and you can find your local service center with the link that'll be provided to you in the chat to see what kind of assistance will be available to you. But they have loan programs, some grant programs, covering a wide variety of assistance from farmland damage and fence loss and crop loss, to also if you actually lost livestock. And they're not always tied to a federal disaster. A lot of times some of these USDA programs are available outside of a federal disaster declaration. Next slide, please. Also with the USDA is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. In rural communities, they're usually housed under the same office location, but again, encourage you to reach out to your Natural Resource Conservation Service, also your Oregon State University Extension Office, sometimes within that same location, but they'll look at what has been impacted on your land and how they can, and they provide that technical assistance and guidance, and we'll look at your specific situation and see what recovery programs are available for you to apply for. So whether that is helping you to restore livestock infrastructure, protecting water quality, repair levees or other structures, or removing debris from stream channels or road culverts, the USDA is your friend for that, for those needs. Next slide, please. The USDA also has a rural development program for housing. Most of these programs are specifically for very low and low income homeowners to repair the owner-occupied homes in a presidentially declared disaster. But they do have quite a variety of home loan and home repair grant programs that may come available to you after a federally declared disaster. Next slide, please. Some other federal agencies, there's alphabet soup here, but we have the IRS, which you've probably heard of that acronym before, the Internal Revenue Service. So they do provide some disaster relief to taxpayers to help them recover financially from the impact of a disaster, and that link will be shared with you in the chat. The Department of Labor provides some disaster unemployment assistance, particularly for those individuals that may not qualify for the normal state unemployment benefits. Then the U.S. Department of Labor can step in. And then Housing and Urban Development will provide community development block grant funds. But occasionally, like we saw in the Labor Day fires, for those major disasters, Congress has to get involved, but they may provide a special appropriation of disaster recovery funds that are earmarked to help communities recover from a disaster. Next slide, please. I know I'm just about out of time. I just have just a few slides left for you. So there are a number of state disaster assistance programs that may become available after a disaster. Funding really varies by program and depending on the biennium and the state fiscal capacity. However, there's several state agencies that I wanted to throw on here. I know it's a lot of acronyms, but Water Resources Department has a well abandonment repair and replacement program that might provide assistance to you to low and moderate income homeowners experiencing well water issues. Department of Environmental Quality will have programs to improve public health and water quality, working very closely with the Oregon Health Authority. The Oregon Health Authority can help with vital records replacement. Department of Transportation can help out with your driver's license replacements, and sometimes there's federal highway administration funds that they work with the federal government to repair certain roadways, unfortunately not private roads and bridges. And then we have a number of other state agencies that may be involved, or very often involved in disaster recovery, including the Oregon Department of Human Services, our agency, the Department of Emergency Management. I mentioned the Department of Financial Regulation. We also have the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice can get involved for you to check if there are any scams in your community after a disaster. Unfortunately, a lot of people, not a lot, but there are some bad actors that come into a disaster, and you can go to the Department of Justice to see what scams are in your area and to report price gouging. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time talking about the local disaster assistance programs because the next two speakers are going to do that. I already mentioned the long-term recovery groups. That's the cooperative body made up of representatives of faith-based and nonprofit and government organizations. Your voluntary organizations active in disaster, I really encourage you to get to know them. You may recognize a lot of those bigger names, but there could be several that you don't, you maybe haven't heard of, like Samaritan's Purse or Operation Barbecue Relief, or Northwest Baptist or Suchi Foundation. There's some really great organizations out there that provide a lot of preparedness, but then disaster response, relief, and long-term recovery assistance. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So some other disaster assistance programs and sources of assistance. Of course, you'll have private donations. Safeway and some corporations do those collections at the register after a disaster sometimes. You might have your philanthropic partners. The Oregon Community Foundation gets involved. Individuals look to GoFundMe and other crowdfunding sources. 211info.org is a great resource to help you identify recovery resources in your community. And then you'll have many other local housing authorities, public health, and community action agencies that get involved with helping your community recover based off of the specific resources in your area. So I know that was a whirlwind. I hope what you got from that was that recovery is a whole team effort. There are a lot of resources out there. Unfortunately, there's not one resource or recovery item that fits all. There's a lot of different disaster assistance programs. But there are a lot of agencies, both at the federal, state, local level, and then those voluntary organizations that are all working together to support you in your community to recover as best as you can. So there's a lot. Just be prepared for that onslaught of resources. And it is a challenging process to navigate, but that's why we have our long-term recovery groups, which you'll hear about next. So thank you so much. I'll be monitoring the chat and helping answer questions at the end. Really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks, Quinn. Our next speaker is Grant Simonton, Recovery and Resource Navigator for the McKenzie Valley Long-Term Recovery Group. He works directly with fire-impacted households to navigate complex state recovery programs and bureaucratic systems, helping them apply for and access the resources needed to rebuild and recover. Take it away, Grant.
Yeah, thanks, Carissa. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As she just described, my name is Grant Simonton, and I provide disaster case management and really work directly with wildfire survivors and fire-impacted households in the McKenzie River Valley. So it's really boots on the ground work, and interacting directly with the community. It's something I really love. And I'll add that I consider myself a young adult, white male, dark hair, pulled in a bun, wearing glasses, and wearing a black shirt today. I'll add that I joined the long-term recovery group in June of 2025, so approaching a year. But it's kind of surreal to reflect on all that I've learned and been involved with in what is a relatively short period of time. And at times it's felt like drinking from the fire hose of information. And then just a little brief background that kind of led me here is that prior to joining the long-term recovery group, I served 2 years with the RARE program, or Resource Assistance for Rural Environments. It was an AmeriCorps program with a 31-year legacy, all about focusing on rural communities in Oregon and adding capacity. And it was through those 2 years of service to rural communities that I really fell in love with community-based and community-centered work. And I genuinely love connecting with, learning from, and supporting rural communities. And I consider myself very lucky to be working with an amazing team of people at the long-term recovery group. And so, segueing into the agenda, I'm going to start off by offering some grounding statements to really kind of inform my presentation, and then segue into an overview of the Holiday Farm Fire, which is the disaster that we're supporting the long-term recovery from. And then some brief background on the McKenzie Valley Long-Term Recovery Group, which I'll generally refer to as the LTRG from this point forward. And then really some overarching themes that will inform the presentation and how to set yourself up for a smooth recovery process. And then really 5 kind of big lessons learned that we wish we would have known as an organization, and we wish households and survivors would have known prior to the disaster. And then segueing into just some post-webinar action items for people and some closing remarks if I don't take up too much time. Next slide, please. So like I said, I want to offer some grounding statements to really inform and ground the information that I'm going to share today. And the first is the collective we versus I. As I mentioned, I joined the LTRG a little under a year ago. So I personally was not involved in the recovery mission in the immediacy after the fire and even in the ensuing years. So when I say we, or if I say we during my presentation, I'm really referring to the collective experiences of myself, but the team that has been doing this work for years now, and some of them who've been involved since directly the days after the fire. And so the next one is, this is not going to be a model for how disaster recovery must be done. But really, the topics and experiences I will share today are not an exhaustive list or demonstrative of how things must be done regarding disaster recovery, but rather suggestions based on some hard-fought wins and experiences through the organization. So, the experiences of your community, I know there's a variety of different individuals attending today, but your experiences will likely be very different than that of the McKenzie River Valley in response and recovery from the Holiday Farm fire. But what I share today will hopefully be, that guiding framework to assist disaster recovery, especially in rural Oregon and especially in rural unincorporated Oregon. And then the final statement I'm kind of break out into 2 points is that, disaster recovery must be trauma informed. Our work, mine specifically, but everyone really at the LTRG is 100% community centered. For all disaster recovery, it's really so important to show up in community. But this is really especially true in rural communities, going to the community, not expecting them to come to you. And ideally, you're going to be doing this with, a trusted local partner or community leader or leaders, someone that can hopefully start that transfer of trust. And the next point is really that, it really has to be trauma informed. And, the work is rooted in trauma-informed care. It's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to really practice it in real life. And that's what we do at the Long-Term Recovery Group. And I really view it as coming from a place of empowerment, especially for disaster survivors and disaster impacted persons, some of them who lost their home, literally everything they owned. Next slide, please. So providing kind of a brief overview of the Holiday Farm fire. The Holiday Farm fire was one of many widespread and devastating wildfires that occurred across different communities in Western and Southern Oregon around Labor Day, so September 7th evening of 2020. Obviously, it was located in the McKenzie Valley. It was a red flag event, so it was just a perfect storm of realities, really high warm temperatures, low humidity, and sustained 80 to 90 mile per hour east winds. In total, before the fire was contained, it burned 173,393 acres, destroying 517 homes and hundreds of outbuildings and other structures on people's properties. The town of Blue River was largely destroyed. The event displaced thousands of residents and crippled local businesses and infrastructure. Next slide, please. So I'm a visual person, so I thought it was helpful to kind of show the fire scar and the totality of the wildfire, and also just to kind of visualize that. I was describing those conditions that led to it, and those winds of 80 to 90 mile per hour winds. But just to underscore the severity of the event, in one portion, the fire moved 27 miles down the McKenzie River corridor in just 4 hours. So it was just an extremely powerful and devastating event that we are working to support the long-term recovery from. Next slide, please. So segueing into just some background for the McKenzie Valley Long-Term Recovery Group. As the previous slides, it described the fire, when it happened, the impacts. So it wasn't until, May of 2021, 8 months later, that the Long-Term Recovery Group was formed with the mission to recognize needs, find resources, and help individuals and families recover from disaster. And then in September of 2021, the organization hired their first executive director, Devin Thompson, who still leads and guides our organization today. And then it wasn't until spring of 2022 that we received funding to hire our first disaster case managers within the long-term recovery group for the McKenzie River Valley. And today we continue that work for disaster recovery and community vitality efforts. Even 5.5 years after the fire, there's still ongoing work to be done. Next slide, please. So how do you set yourself up for a smoother recovery process? As I've mentioned, I'm going to share a variety of different kind of suggestions, informations, experience, lessons learned pertaining to different recovery topics. Again, based on our collective experiences, all things we wish we as a team, but also the community and survivors and impacted persons would know. So the four overarching themes are really, the first is recovery and preparedness are interconnected. I'm going to be saying this throughout my presentation, but it's just a critical one. And, today's webinar is centered on recovery, whereas the previous one in April was centered more on preparedness. And I know they're connected, which really segues into the point that you can't discuss recovery without also talking about preparedness. They are interconnected. Recovery begins during preparation. And the more effort and energy you, your household, your community, local government, organizations put into preparedness, the smoother your recovery process will be. I really can't emphasize that enough. And then the second theme is that it's just the importance of your local community. We're talking about rural communities. We're talking about rural unincorporated Oregon. So your community, your neighbors, and the relationships amongst those are just so critical. And then next is knowing your home and knowing the surrounding environment. And it's just really important to understand everything about both those things and how various improvements or resiliency, improvements to the home can increase your resilience and recovery from natural disasters. And then the final thing is, I think this is easy to say in kind of a vacuum, but working with survivors is do not do things in haste. Everything is a process. I know it can sound easier said than done, but things don't have to happen overnight, and you will benefit from taking some time to reflect and be intentional about the decisions you make for your personal or individualized recovery journey. Next slide, please. So with all that background and grounding, I want to get into kind of 5 hard lessons learned from our experience supporting long-term recovery, working directly with wildfire survivors, and navigating various bureaucratic systems. Next slide, please. So the first is, understanding your home and homeowners insurance policy. So, it's important to understand your homes and its needs and how it may be impacted by disasters. I kind of already got into this and that overarching theme, but it's just important to understand and to reflect on. So, what environment are you living in? Are you living in a heavily forested area, a coastal area, prairie lands? All will have different potential impacts to your home, community, and recovery from various types of disasters. But the real central lesson that we've navigated and I've learned from or about in supporting people is your homeowner's insurance. One of the central lessons learned out of the Holiday Farm fire and the long-term recovery from it is understanding the specifics of your homeowner's insurance policy. There's a lot of intricacies surrounding it. It can be quite complex, confusing. But as Quinn mentioned in the different types of disaster assistance, the private insurance market is going to be the primary avenue for disaster recovery in our state, and what's going to assist you, in your recovery from a natural disaster. It won't be the only one, but it is likely going to be the primary one. And so after the fire, in the recovery journey of fire survivors, many people unfortunately realized that their insurance coverage was inadequate to cover the total cost of rebuilding their home. And some main reasons for that were that, as I kind of mentioned, people didn't understand their homeowners insurance policy. They thought it might have covered more, but in reality, what their policy limits covered did not provide sufficient resources to rebuild or reconstruct their home. And they only realized that until after the fire and they'd gone through the claim process. And then connected to that is that a lot of people didn't include additional declarations or provisions, endorsements, things that you can add to your homeowner's insurance policy that will pay out additional funds for, say, a total reconstruction in the event of a total loss, or also providing additional living expenses that can cover interim housing, sometimes up to a year and a half or 2 years. And then the next one is that, a lot of the homes in the McKenzie, some of them were built in the 30s and the 40s at the turn of the century. So their property value, and the kind of underlying connection to what they were insured for was not very high, which just kind of compounded the realities I've already mentioned. But really, a compounding reality to all this is what was happening in late 2020. It was COVID, which created severe economic fluctuations to supply and demand. COVID threw a giant wrench into global and domestic economies and the supply chain. The cost of goods and materials skyrocketed, really as demonstrated by lumber prices, which were literally changing weekly. And when you're trying to rebuild a stick-built home, that's like the last material that you want to rapidly increase in cost, paired with not having adequate insurance to cover that rebuild. And then finally is that this was paired with hundreds of people across the state of Oregon that were dealing with this destruction at the same time. I'm talking about the experience of the McKenzie River Valley, and it localized to that area. But it was the Labor Day fire, so there was just a sudden influx of demand for all of this, paired with those other points that I just mentioned. Many of the wildfire survivors we have worked with and I work with, as I've mentioned, did not have adequate insurance, and they had to either tap into or drain their retirement accounts, their savings, 401ks, take on new mortgages or a small business administration loan to finish their rebuild. This wasn't everyone, but it was a lot of people. And I just want to share a brief example of a couple that we have worked with in their late 60s, early 70s, home totally destroyed, escaped with kind of the clothes on their back. They decide they want to come back home. Long story short, they spent everything they had to rebuild their home. And we assisted them in applying to a state recovery program and to navigate it, and that can provide assistance, reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses. And so we got to the end that they were going to get $100,000 back, and we set up the award call. They came to the intake center. And when they first heard that they were getting that amount of money back, they both just broke down. It was an incredibly raw but powerful experience, because they shared that they never thought they'd be able to retire, and just how life-changing that award was, and our support to navigate that process through them. And so next is really the insurance claim process. When it comes to that, I really emphasize the word process. From our experience working with fire survivors, it's really important to start that process early, but to not do it in haste. And I know it's hard to say that, but especially in the days and months following a disaster, it takes time to process, and things don't have to happen overnight. You might start the claims process, but it's not going to be wrapped up just like that. So Some survivors had great experiences with their insurance company and their claims and adjusters. They had little to no issues working within that bureaucracy and that process, but unfortunately, many had the opposite. Some of them had to work with upwards of 4 or 5 claims adjusters, having to retell their story and recomplete paperwork. And I understand it's part of the process, but it wasn't very trauma informed, because reliving those experiences really triggers people's effects from the fire. And some survivors ended up settling with their insurance company because they became so defeated by the back and forth process. As I mentioned, new adjusters, having to retell the story, fill out paperwork, all re-traumatizing them and bringing up very, very raw emotions in the months and even years after the fire. And so they wanted to be done. They wanted to close that process, get the funds, and move forward. And some of them did that and didn't get the full amounts that they really deserved. But really, everything is a process. Don't rush through it. And this is another point I'm going to say throughout my presentation, is just be sure to keep very detailed records of all communication with your insurance company, your adjuster, letters, emails. If you talk to someone on the phone, follow up via email or whatnot to get that in writing. And then the last point is really maintaining insurance coverage. Everyone makes their own choices regarding finances in their home. But I just want to emphasize the importance that, there are fire survivors that I'm still working with who, for whatever reason, at the time of the fire, did not have homeowners insurance coverage. Some of them were only able to receive up to the $35,000 from FEMA, but it's made their recovery journey incredibly painful and challenging, and still ongoing, 5.5 years after the fire. And then lastly, I want to acknowledge that it is becoming increasingly challenging for homeowners in disaster-prone areas to maintain that coverage, as the cost to adequately insure your home is rapidly increasing. And that's, kind of paired with that insurers don't necessarily want to cover you, or they might drop you because of where you're located. And you can do everything to, create defensible space and fuels reduction. But even then, it's an ongoing issue, and it's a challenge for a lot of people, especially aging populations who are often on fixed incomes, and their home is their greatest asset. And for us in the McKenzie, when that home burned down and it was paid off, and then they rebuilt and had to take on more debt, they just don't have as much economic fluidity, so to speak. Next slide, please. So I already talked about, and just to add this picture on the right is someone's home that was rebuilt and community members supporting that recovery. But as I was saying, I already kind of touched on that first one. Insurance payouts were often insufficient to cover the total rebuild costs. Out of the 517 homes destroyed, many were secondary homes, but many were primary as well. So, some people decided to sell their properties, but many chose to rebuild and come back to the amazing community that is the McKenzie. So, I mentioned that private insurance is the primary vehicle for disaster recovery, but that doesn't mean there aren't additional resources available to you, as evidenced by Quinn's presentation. And that's why it's really important to research all available funds. And this is where local relationships and trusted community-based organizations, whether formal or informal, and voices can be so important, as they can share details and specifics about available resources to community members, how to apply to them, how to navigate the system, and all ideally while being a trusted voice. The main program I'm navigating is very complex and bureaucratic. It's challenging even for myself. But many of the senior citizens that I work with, they either don't have access to a computer or the internet, or really the kind of digital literacy to understand it. And so they really rely on someone like myself and our team to support them and advocate for them as they navigate that process. And then when it comes to, say, finding a contractor to either repair or reconstruct your home, I can't emphasize this one enough as well. Do your research. Don't rush. This is my belief, but I think there are a lot of wonderful humans in the world, but unfortunately, there are also people that seek to take advantage of those in desperate situation, and disaster recovery is no exception to that. So a couple best practices for people is if you do find a contractor, search the Oregon Construction Contractors Board to see if there's any filed complaints, ensure that they are licensed, bonded, and insured. And, references are a very powerful tool. So talk to your community, if there's a local Facebook page, post on that and see if anyone can give you any information. And these next 2 points might seem self-evident, but get everything in writing and only work off a ratified contract, and never pay the full amount up front. If I had more time, I would provide some more examples, but there's a handful of households that we've supported that did not do those 2 things, and it's made their recovery journey incredibly painful. And so I've kind of alluded this or skirted this a bit, but whenever there's a disaster, there's going to be bad faith actors and contractor fraud, unfortunately. And I wanted to bring up an example of that, of someone that we have worked with and we continue to work with, that they built their original homes themselves. It was going to be their retirement home. It was literally finished like right before the fire. They hadn't even got occupancy yet, but then the fire hit, completely destroyed the home. They decided they wanted to come back. So, they start the rebuild process, find a contractor, their license, bonded, and insured, seemed everything was fine, hired them to do the work. And then it turns out the contractor really did not know what they were doing and overpromised on their abilities, poured a foundation, framed, walled, roof. But due to some clear issues and the work not passing inspections, the survivors took them to court, which led to a very long legal proceeding, ultimately costing them a couple $100,000 and tapping their resources. And that home is still not finished today. And we are currently still working with them to try and get that finished, the home finished, through a state recovery program. But it's been an incredibly painful and years-long experience for them. And it's honestly it's heartbreaking. But I'm sharing some of these experiences to hopefully have them as lessons learned or prevent future people in disasters from having to go through them. And then very briefly, the last point is your mortgage. Just understanding your obligations when it comes to it. Some companies, whether the mortgage company or insurance company, will require you to pay that balance off or that note off with your insurance proceeds. Regardless of whatever you do, keep very detailed records of everything related to that. If a federally declared disaster comes along, the disaster is federally declared and federal funds can flow in, you're going to want this type of documentation to kind of but kind of satisfy some of these programmatic requirements. That if anyone has questions, I can follow up with you. But for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. Next slide, please. So again, I feel like I'm parroting myself a couple times here, but document storage and record keeping are so important to set yourself up for a smoother recovery process. Keep records of everything related to that process: receipts, invoices, contracts. If a lot of people paid cash for things, and if you do pay for cash for something, have that vendor, that contractor draft a letter. It could even be written on a piece of paper stating paid in cash, paid in full, services rendered. That'll just help you later on. And our experiences supporting survivors has really underscored how interconnected, again, preparedness and recovery are. So ensuring that you have physical copies of important documents, such as the ones on the screen, and having them in a secure and accessible location, maybe next to a go bag, someone you feel comfortable with, but that should you need to evacuate and tap into that recovery system, you have the documents needed for it. And for immediate assistance, that proof of occupancy was a really important one. A lease agreement, for instance, if you're a renter. But some people didn't have that, and it made it challenging for them to tap into those resources. And then later on, if or when state assistance or federal assistance will come along, you'll want to have all those records to support your application to those resources. Next slide, please. So local relationships and local recovery, in rural unincorporated Oregon, which is the McKenzie, the kind of local government is the county. But in these areas, your local community, your neighbors, and your relationships amongst them are so, so important. Director McMahon already kind of highlighted this in her introductions, but it's something that we have really learned and are kind of emphasizing whenever we talk about long-term recovery, of just how important that is. That, along with your rural fire protection and search and rescue districts or your county sheriff's office and your community, they're going to be the first boots on the ground. I want to emphasize this point, as disasters are becoming more severe and more common in our state. It's critical to lean into these dynamics and prepare for them by developing those relationships. Recovery, preparedness, and resilience, they're interconnected. So when it came to the kind of initial government response versus local response, the initial state and county response was somewhat limited, with the important exception of the fire protection district and the county's office. And I'm not casting any aspersions on anyone. Oregon had never really seen or experienced disasters of these scale in modern times, and they were happening at multiple points around the state. And even so, with that informal response in the McKenzie, it was still pretty chaotic and unorganized, but still very important to get those resources out and help with information, which really segues into the next point, which is trusted local partners. People, especially in rural areas, can be very skeptical about the government, but also outside help and outsiders, which is why local expertise and understanding of community needs and sensitivities is so, so critical. In these communities, people are much more likely to trust and engage with individuals and networks, whether informal or formal, from their own community. And a real world example of this is that the organization called Locals Helping Locals, which was started as an informal group, like literally the day after the fire, as a loose group, later evolving into something more permanent of a nonprofit. But it was started by survivors. Started immediately after the fire, that acted as a trusted and respected group and kind of became a voice of the community in the ensuing months and years after disaster. They coordinated events about resources available, how to access them, and hosted them in the community, not Eugene or Springfield, but in the community. And that's something that Quinn had mentioned of, kind of information sessions being hosted in the school, which is often a kind of a heartbeat of a rural community. Just the importance of bringing that to the community. And then the next one is developing relationships before disasters. I feel like I'm kind of, weaving this into what I've already been saying, but, rural communities typically have a lot of social capital. They have those connections, they have the trust between people, and this is an extremely powerful and potent asset, and something that we wish we would have known and the community would have known prior to the disaster. If you start by identifying, connecting that capital before disaster happens, you're going to be in a better place. And this is really a perfect representation of how preparedness and recovery are interconnected. And so some things that you can do are, advocate for community engagement and preparedness during blue sky times or between when disasters hit. Build those relationships before disaster happens, whether informal bonds amongst neighbors, a phone tree, a radio tree. There's a kind of an informal, I'd say more formal group of residents in the McKenzie that have a radio tree. And then beyond that, you could consider the establishment of, informal or formal community-based organizations to meet maybe once a quarter and share information and just kind of start to build those relationships with different partners in your area too. And all of this can lead into developing the trusted local partners to be a voice or voices of the community. And if you build that local capacity and establish those good relationships before the disaster happens. And you can understand who to call to get that information out into the community until more formal help gets there. It's just really important to kind of get those accurate answers and information out to the community beyond those kind of wireless emergency alerts or things posted by the sheriff's office or fire protection district. But misinformation can spread rapidly and can cause a lot of fear, panic, and distrust. And then I realized I didn't say that this image in the bottom right of this slide is community members kind of coming together to support like a work party of someone's home that was burned down. Next slide, please. So my final kind of lesson learned is about mental health. The effects of disaster on mental health. In the immediate aftermath of a disaster, the one we're supporting the long-term recovery from was a devastating wildfire, destroyed so much. But in that aftermath, people are in survival mode. They're trying to provide basic needs for themselves, their families, their pets. The questions, some of them flowing through their minds are, where am I going to sleep tonight? Where are we going to sleep tonight? What are we going to eat? What am I supposed to do? Disasters, regardless of their scale, will cause trauma and have an impact on your mental health and sometimes physical health. And that can really manifest in shock, anxiety, depression, grief, post-traumatic stress responses. And these things are by no means exclusive to right after event. They can be long lasting, even years after the event. Even if someone kind of processed them or they didn't, they'll be there for years. Which is really why it's so important to talk about your experiences. You don't have to do it alone, and you don't have to be afraid to ask for help. Don't let pride get in the way. This can be especially true for men, and experiences that the team has had with different people, that it's okay to not be okay, especially after disaster in which you lost everything. You lost your home, everything you owned, and you escaped with just the clothes on your back. And maybe because your neighbor ran to your door pounding it in the middle of the night, say, you got to get out now. Being vulnerable doesn't make you weak. And the final point is that everyone deals with trauma differently. When I work with survivors first, we create the space for them to come to, say, our intake center, and really just encourage them to share their experience, share their story, before we even get into how we're going to apply to this recovery program and all the kind of intricacies of it. Sometimes it's been 2 hours. You're connecting with the person, you're empathizing with them, you're supporting them, and it can be really cathartic for people. And I want to share a specific example of this is that there's a fire survivor whose home burned down. They evacuated. They were able to rebuild their home. And there's a state recovery program I had mentioned that can reimburse people for out-of-pocket expenses. And so, we developed a list. We found this person, called, emailed, they didn't respond, called, emailed a couple more times, no response. That's okay. So we go to their house, knock on their door, introduce ourselves. She invites us in, make a connection, and say, hey, I think this could really, really benefit you. So let's set up an appointment. So set up an appointment. She comes to the intake center and she's carrying this cardboard tote box. And she goes on to say that everything related to my recovery journey, everything related to my insurance, my rebuild, applying to FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency funds, Small Business Administration, really paying off their mortgage, everything was in that box. And she said, I have not looked at this since I've come back home, and I didn't think I was going to be able to do it. And so I don't want to say coaching her, but encouraging her and say, like, I'm here to support you throughout this entire process, and I'm not going to go away. Enabled her to open up, to physically open that box, but also, my read is that she also compartmentalized not just those physical documents, but her trauma and all that emotion from that event was in that box. And as we went through it together, I felt her kind of let go of some of it. And as we worked together over multiple times, I felt her really opening up out of her shell. And I imagine that was an incredibly powerful experience for her, but it was also for me as just someone that's a big empath and loves working with people. And just that's a real world example of how everyone deals with it differently. Next slide, please. So these are a couple post-webinar action items, both of which I kind of already highlighted, but I just encourage everyone, for homeowners, but also for renters, that you review your homeowner's insurance policy yearly to really understand what those coverages are and consider adding those provisions or endorsements that can increase your payout if disaster happens and if it's a total loss. And that taking detailed pictures or videos of your personal inventory, and this is something that Quinn had mentioned, but that literally everywhere in your house, drawers, closets, your outbuildings, garage, and doing both those things yearly will just set yourself up for success should disaster happen. And then second is making copies of important documentation. The slide deck will be shared today, so you can go to that other one that I had that listed all of those documents out. But I just encourage everyone to make copies of those and have them in a secure, accessible location so that you know where they are, and should you need to evacuate, they'll be there. And also, if you feel comfortable, consider adding them to a secure cloud-based storage so you can have them digitally and physically. Next slide, please. So that's the end of the presentation. On the dry one, it was more than I anticipated, so I cut out some, but I just want to reiterate and underscore briefly the importance of being prepared before disaster happens and how that will enable a smoother recovery process for everyone involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. Now we will hear from Christy Leiuallen, Executive Director of the United Way of the Blue Mountains. She works alongside community members and partners to strengthen lives across the region. She is deeply committed to listening, building relationships, and supporting solutions that are rooted in the strengths and needs of local communities. Take it away, Christy.
Thanks, Carissa. And thank you, Quinn, for setting the stage, and Grant, thank you. Those stories really resonate with me. We had so many of the same stories for our disasters and the same barriers. So thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Leiuallen. I'm the Executive Director of United Way of the Blue Mountains. We serve Walla Walla, Columbia, and Garfield counties in Washington, and Umatilla, Morrow, Wallowa, Union, and Baker counties in Oregon. I'm also the chair of the Blue Mountain Region Long-Term Recovery Group, which currently serves Walla Walla, Columbia in Washington, and Wallowa and Umatilla counties in Oregon. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white female with blonde hair, and my shirt is black, and I'm wearing a blue jacket today. I want to talk to you about long-term disaster recovery, what it looks like in rural communities, why coordination matters, and how communities can come together to support survivors long after the initial response. At the core, a LTRG, or a long-term recovery group, is not a single organization. It's a group of partners, nonprofits, faith-based communities, local government, businesses, all coming together with a shared purpose. And that purpose is to make sure that no survivor falls through the cracks during their recovery. It's really about coordination, bringing everyone to the same table. Next slide, please. This picture shows two men standing on a roof while floodwaters rise nearly to the windows. Inside the home, a woman is trying to pack belongings as the water continues to rise. In the driveway, you can only see the very top of a submerged car beneath the floodwaters. I will say that later that evening, this family was rescued by helicopter. In February of 2020, the Blue Mountain region, including Walla Walla and Columbia counties in Washington and Umatilla County in Oregon, experienced devastating flooding that impacted more than 600 families. This was a 500-year flood event. And although the floods impacted communities on both sides of the state line, Oregon received a FEMA Individual Assistance Declaration, while Washington did not. This created additional challenges because recovery systems and resources were different in each state. And at the time, if you remember, this is February of 2020, COVID-19 pandemic also hit, making it much harder to meet the survivors, assess damage, and coordinate recovery efforts, especially in rural communities already facing limited resources. One of the most important supports we had during this time was our FEMA Voluntary Agency Liaison, or FEMA VAL. She was incredibly knowledgeable about long-term recovery and really helped guide us through the process step by step. At the same time, many of us had never built a long-term recovery group before, and she continually reminded us that recovery systems take time to build. I will say that we built one long-term recovery group for all of these counties. And the reason why is because in rural communities, as you know, resources are tight, and so are people. And so we needed to make sure that we had the best and the brightest at the table, and that was going across state lines and county lines. Forming the Blue Mountain Long-Term Recovery Group was not easy. There was pressure to move quickly, distribute the funds immediately, but our FEMA VAL kept reminding us that a strong recovery system takes time to build. It took about 6 or 7 months before the disaster case managers were fully working with survivors. During the first few months following the disaster, some organizations chose to distribute funds directly without case management or recovery planning. Later, many of those families still needed help, but because the funds had already been distributed, there was limits to the LTRG could do, and we weren't able to help them. One family's home had shifted off its foundation during the flood, and they had lost power, running water, their toilets didn't work, they were cooking outside. And one organization stepped in and said, we think that the Blue Mountain Long-Term Recovery Group is moving too slow. We're going to help this family out. And so they gave them a significant amount of money directly. But instead of repairing the home, the head of the household purchased a saddle, even though they didn't own a horse. Because of this, they were not able to repair their home, and they weren't able to get the critical repairs done. It was an important lesson in why coordination, accountability, and structured recovery systems matter in long-term disaster. LTRGs do not give funds directly to survivors because recovery dollars are limited and must be carefully managed to support long-term recovery needs. Instead, LTRGs paid vendors and contractors directly to ensure funds are used for approved recovery work and the unmet needs. Next slide, please. This picture is an exterior wall of a home. The sides the size of the holes are about the size of a baseball, and all of the windows have been blown out. By August of 22, the Blue Mountain Region LTRG had nearly completed recovery from the 2020 floods. In fact, we only had one case remaining when the town of Leiuallen was struck by a devastating hailstorm. The hailstones were the size of softballs, and it caused catastrophic damage throughout the community. Nearly 500 homes in the town of Leiuallen were heavily damaged or destroyed, and almost all the vehicles' windows in the town were shattered by the storm, along with radiators and headlights. The hail was so intense that screws were actually pulled out of the metal roofs and by the force of the impact. And you could actually see that they unscrewed. It was absolutely incredible. So we had roofs, siding, windows, and vehicles across the community that were either heavily damaged or destroyed. At the same time, Leiuallen County was also dealing with an active wildfire. So much of the emergency response and attention and the resources were focused elsewhere, and the town of Leiuallen was not receiving the supports it needed for the hailstorm recovery. Because our long-term recovery group was already established and operating, we were able to respond quickly with support from Oregon Emergency Management, and at the request of the mayor and the county commissioners, the Blue Mountain Region Long-Term Recovery Group stepped in to help coordinate recovery efforts. We worked with disaster case managers, state disaster case managers, volunteers, community partners to support households and businesses as we navigated the recovery process. A few of our long-term recovery group individuals stepped off. They served only Umatilla or Walla Walla County. But the great thing is that they also committed that if we have another disaster in those communities, they will step back onto our recovery group. So we were able to add new local individuals down in Leiuallen, and also continue relationships in Umatilla and Walla Walla counties. By the time we completed our final case in September of 2024, we had supported 413 survivor cases. So 500 homes in Leiuallen, and we supported 413 survivor cases, including 292 primary homes, 77 businesses, and we coordinated the removal of 44 hazardous trees that died as a result of the storm. Having an LTRG already in place made a tremendous difference in how quickly we were able to organize, respond, and support our community through disaster. But there were definitely challenges along the way. When we first started working in Leiuallen, the mayor was frustrated that no one had reached out immediately after the disaster, and the community didn't understand who we were or what we were. So it took the entire executive team sitting down with the mayor to explain that we were there to support the community. OEM was at that meeting also, Oregon Emergency Management, and we had to let them know that we weren't coming in to take their funds and disappear. What we really, really needed to do was get the mayor and everyone else to understand that we were there to help through the entire recovery process and that we weren't going to leave until the end. So what started as a very tense meeting eventually turned into one of my greatest friendships, and it became an important reminder that relationships and trust are the backbone to long-term recovery. Next slide, please. So why is long-term recovery? What does it matter? Long-term recovery matters because it doesn't end when a disaster is over. In fact, it's just beginning. In rural communities, many survivors are hard to reach, and traditional systems don't always work. Many of the people impacted in our region were older adults living in poverty, and most of them that did not have computers. Some didn't even have phones. We literally had to go door to door, sit down with a survivor, and help them navigate the recovery process. Long-term recovery groups help identify unmet needs, connect survivors to resources, and make sure people are supported throughout the recovery process. Next slide. The goal of the long-term recovery group is to help survivors return to these four things: safe, sanitary, secure, and functional. In other words, helping families get back into stable living conditions where they can safely live day to day and begin to rebuild their lives after a disaster. Long-term recovery focuses on meeting basic needs and returning survivors to a new normal as quickly and safely as possible. Recovery work also includes mitigation measures and improvements that help reduce damage for future disasters and strengthen community resilience. The town of Leiuallen actually had a fire way back when. In fact, we weren't even able to find very many community members that saw the fire go through Leiuallen or heard about it. But when we started opening up roofs and repairing roofs, we found those fires consistent through most of the homes in Leiuallen, which just shows that, we need to build back better every single time. Next slide, please. I want to go through kind of 2 rules of thumbs. The first one is important concept in disaster recovery. It's called the rule of 10. So to keep it simple for us, we're going to say if we had if the rescue lasts 10 days, then the relief would last 100 days. We multiply everything by 10. And then the recovery would take about 1,000 days or nearly 3 years. So while every disaster is different, the principle reminds us that recovery is a long-term process. And we've heard that over and over from Grant and from Quinn, but it is really, really long. We need to make sure that community members and survivors understand that their house won't be repaired, rebuilt, or replaced in the next few days. It takes a long time. Another rule is the 90-10 rule. About 90% of the donations are raised during the rescue and relief phases, even though only about 10% of those funds are actually needed at that time. Meanwhile, long-term requires about 90% of the resources, but only receives about 10% of the donations. That is why fundraising for recovery must be early and continued long after the initial response. So setting up some kind of fundraising mechanism, either with a local United Way or another charity in the community that would be the fiscal sponsor, is so vital to this work. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of a funnel, and at the bottom of the funnel, heading out, is insurance. And so we typically start with the insurance in the recovery phase, and then we go into, if we're lucky enough, FEMA individual assistance and SBA or small business administrative loans for disaster. Additional supports can come from the state, local, tribal, nonprofit, faith-based, and other community resources. But we really, really want you to understand that the LTRG is the very, very, very last resource for this system. We help support and find all the others, but our dollars are the last dollars to the table. Throughout this process, we work with disaster case managers, work one-on-one. They understand their needs, develop a recovery plan, and connect them to these resources. And then if they aren't connected to these resources, we take them to the unmet needs table, which we'll get into in a few minutes. We also want to make sure that we're not duplicating benefits. One thing that can happen sometimes is if the FEMA individual assistance declaration happens, each survivor family receives a certain amount of money for that household. And I believe, Quinn, you put it somewhere around 40. During our time, it was $36,000 for families. And if they incorrectly use that money or they duplicate the same recovery for that money, those dollars can be actually requested back from FEMA. So it's really, really important for our DCMs to explain all of that. Next slide, please. Long-term recovery is not just about rebuilding homes. It's about coordinating people, resources, and services to help survivors move forward after a disaster. Recovery often involves many different organizations and systems working together over a long period of time. The goal is to identify unmet needs, connect survivors to support, and make sure recovery resources are used in a coordinated and effective way. Next slide. And so this is where recovery and coordination really begins. The disaster case manager works one-on-one with survivors to understand their situation, develop a recovery plan, and identify what help is still needed after insurance and other assistance. Grant talked a lot about this. I think what I would like to say is we also worked in Leiuallen with the city. And if someone hadn't paid their water bill and their water had been shut off before the hailstorm, that wasn't something that we could help with. But we also made sure that the city had a good conduit to the survivor and set up some kind of payment plan to get that water turned back on. So we couldn't help individuals that had some other kind of problem. We could only connect them to other resources. We had to stay within our lane, that if it was an impact from the hailstorm, we could support, but if it was outside of that hailstorm, we weren't able to support with the recovery or that piece of their recovery process. Next slide. Recovery involves many different partners and resources. Without coordination, it is easy to duplicate assistance, while others go with unmet needs. Many recovery challenges appear months later, making coordination critical to maximizing resources and supporting survivors. Next slide, please. So this gets into the fun. The Blue Mountain Long-Term Recovery Group is organized into several subcommittees and one main committee, the functional areas that work together to support recovery. These committees include the executive committee that oversees all of our work, the construction committee, the volunteer committee, communications, donation management, spiritual emotional care, the unmet needs table, and disaster case management. The executive committee provides overall leadership and helps guide the entire recovery process. This committee is responsible for creating bylaws, setting policies and procedures, and building the structure that allows individuals and families to move through recovery in a clear, coordinated way. The construction committee oversees repairs and rebuilding projects. Our construction committee met every week to review cases and make sure survivors were getting a fair deal. Volunteer teams recruit and organize volunteers. In Leiuallen, the snow came early in 2022. In fact, I think our first snowstorm was September or early October. So our volunteer committee organized volunteers that boarded up windows so that the survivors could make it through the winter. I think the other part of that was our spiritual emotional committee. They support disaster case managers, volunteers with their emotional needs. And this is hard work. One example of how they helped is they would sit with our survivors while we were boarding up windows, have a cup of coffee, and talk about how they were managing their stress. And this really, really brought the stress down. And sometimes we actually had to pick them up and take them off of the property while their home was being boarded up because there was so much anxiety and stress during that time. Communication, that handles our outreach of information and sharing, both for the public and our survivors. Donation management tracks and allocates in-kind donations. Be careful with this one. Donation management is a hard one. We decided not to set up donation management for either of our disasters. We started to, but then heard the horror stories of like snow and people were receiving bathing suits during that time. So if you are going to do donation management, be very, very, very specific on what kind of donations are needed, or turn that over to your volunteer committee and communications committee to say, we are looking for this, and the volunteers can actually go and pick it up and make sure it's going to work for that family. One of the most important and impactful parts of long-term recovery group is the unmet needs table. The unmet needs table is where partners come together to review survivor cases after all other resources have been exhausted. Organizations and individuals earn a seat at the table by contributing money, manpower, and materials. What makes this process so unique is that every organization keeps control of their own resources if they want. There's also a fiscal agent that can hold those dollars if they want and just support the work as we go along. Partners hear survivor cases directly, and they decide individually or as an organization how they want to help. This collaborative approach creates transparency, strengthens partnerships, and helps maximize support for survivors while allowing organizations to maintain their independence. One example of this was in Leiuallen. We had a church that repaired car windows. So every case that was a car window that had been vetted by our case manager, the church paid for the replacement window. Disaster case management or case managers or DCMs guide survivors through the recovery process. And we heard a lot from Grant about this. DCMs are one of the most important parts of our long-term recovery group. And there is no one-size-fits-all approach to building a strong team. Effective case managers come from many different backgrounds. And we learned during COVID-19 that some of our case management, not all, but some of our case management could actually be done virtually or by phone. So during our recovery work, we partnered with the social work students at our local university. They were able to get critical hours for their degree, but also they learned so much about working with individuals in crisis. Local community members were amazing. We were able to hire and have volunteer local members that were case managers. Retired individuals were great because they really wanted to have that individual connection with our survivors. And so they were willing to sit down, have a cup of coffee, and really build that case with the individuals. In fact, we had one retired individual that was working remote for Leiuallen, and she loved the community so much, she ended up moving there during our recovery process. And even state disaster case managers who specialize in serving very low-income families were helping with the case management. Some of our strongest case managers were people who already knew the community and had trusted relationships with survivors. Their compassion, communication skills, and willingness to walk alongside survivors made a huge difference throughout the recovery process. The only thing that I would say about having community members become your disaster case managers is watch for biases. Sometimes those come out.
Apologies. Sorry, we'll interrupt. We have one of our interpreters. I think you went back to the English channel. Go ahead, Christy.
Thank you. And that is why training is so important. We want to reduce those biases, but also we need to make sure that we're training our case managers in recovery systems. Case managers, disaster case managers are much different than just a basic case manager that may work in social work or other situations. They need recovery systems, how to document, obviously confidentiality, knowing how the FEMA system works, insurance, small business administration loans, and community resources so that they can support survivors effectively and ethically. Good training also creates consistency across the team, so survivors receive clear information, fair support, and strong advocacy throughout the recovery process. We were so lucky to have experts on our LTRG that knew the best trainings and were able to arrange trainings for our disaster case managers. Some of those trainings happened through FEMA VALs, and others were through the Lutheran Disaster Services. They were absolutely incredible, and our case managers came back with a wealth of information and felt empowered and energized to really help our people. Next slide, please. So, how do you get involved? One of the biggest lessons in the disaster recovery is recovery before the disaster actually happens. Communities that recover smoothly are the ones that build relationships early. And we heard Grant and we heard Quinn say this. Understand local resources, plan ahead for long-term recovery. That means getting to know local emergency managers, mayors, county commissioners, nonprofits, faith-based communities, and other people already serving the community every day. Standing up a long-term recovery group after disaster can take months. I mean, during our 2020 flood, it took about 7 months to fully build our recovery system and the case manager process. After the Leiuallen hailstorm, because our relationships and our systems were already in place, we were able to organize in 2 to 3 months, and that is fast. So communities need to be communicated with during this time. We set up several information systems. We had dinners, community dinners, so that we could really talk to our communities about what was going on and how long this process was actually going to take, because they're angry. They are trying to figure out how to navigate the system alone, and they don't understand. And so we really wanted to set up areas and systems and people that could communicate well during those 2 to 3 months or those 7 months while we were trying to get this started, so that people understood that we weren't leaving, that we were going to stay in community, but this process takes a long time. As communities prepare for future disasters, there are several simple but important ways to get involved, and they're up on your screen right now. So get to know your local emergency manager. Build relationships before the disaster strikes. Understand your local resources and community capacity. Identify who already are leaders in our communities, and they can be through organizations, they can be through government, but it can also be those individuals that just know everybody and that can come and help you communicate to the community. Start conversations about long-term recovery early. Every community may not have an LTRG today, but every community can build relationships and systems that make recovery possible. And sometimes you may have a lot of strong personalities in the room, and to make sure that everybody feels the same and understands what an LTRG is really, really important. Because if you can't get all of those leaders in the room to understand an LTRG, then you're going to have a fragmented system. So understanding that, going through some trainings, there's a lot of us out there that would be happy to come and give a presentation to your community about an LTRG, and make sure you've done the research, because like we have Baker and Union counties in Oregon. If somebody asked us to come in, our LTRG would probably do that. So look around at other communities that are next to you and see if they're willing to take you on before going through all of the processes of building that LTRG. Next slide. So thank you. Thank you for your time and your commitment today, and thank you for preparing early.
Thank you, Christy. For more information on personal preparedness, check out the Oregon Department of Emergency Management's Be 2 Weeks Ready program at www.oregon.gov/Be2weeksready. The information is available in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Russian, Chinese, with videos with American Sign Language, narration, and closed captions. We will have the toolkit available in Ukrainian next month. I'd like to give a special thank you to all of our presenters for sharing their wisdom and experience with us today. We hope this information will help you and your community become more prepared. At this time, we welcome you to ask any questions you may have. You can type your questions, recommendations, or comments using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll now pass it over to Shirley Blake, Public Information Officer with the Oregon Department of Emergency Management. Thanks, Shirley.
Thanks, Carissa, and thanks everybody for being here. And what a great presentation. So thanks to all our presenters for sharing valuable information. So it looks like all of our Q&As were answered. If you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A portion and we will get those answered. I also wanted to share that I put in the chat that these slides and there will be resource links that will be sent out sometime later today after the webinar. Those will be sent out by Kayla. And the webinar recording will also be shared out with registered participants within the next couple of weeks. It takes some time to process all of this. And since all the webinar recordings will be shared out in various languages, including the slides, but for the video recordings, it does take some time for that to process. They will also be posted on our YouTube channel. So all of that information is going to be sent out. And thanks again to Quinn, to Grant, to Christy, to Kayla, Carissa, the director, and all the participants that were able to join us. It doesn't look like we have any unanswered questions, but if you do, feel free to post those, and we will also send the Q&A out with the recording. So back over to you, Carissa.
All right. Thank you again to all of our presenters for giving us your time today and to the community partners who made this webinar possible. Oregon State University Extension Service, Oregon Sea Grant, Upstream Access, Woodburn Community Emergency Response Team, and Oregon Association of Area Agencies on Aging. Thank you also to the interpreters for providing language access for our participants. On behalf of the planning team, thank you for participating in today's session. You will receive a follow-up email with the feedback survey, resource links, and other supportive information. The recordings will be posted to the Be 2 Weeks Ready YouTube channel in the next few weeks. Take care.